All right. It is 12:03 p.m. Eastern in Southeast Michigan at the University of Michigan. Welcome. My name is Muzammil Hussain. I'm a professor at the Department of Communication and Media in the College of LS&A at the University of Michigan. I'm also the Associate Director for the Center for Middle East and North African Studies. And I welcome you to our virtual session at the center. This center focuses on the study of Middle Eastern and North African region, which has been going on at this university since as early as 1889. The programmatic study of the region, however, began a little bit later in 1961. And so we have recently celebrated our center's 60th anniversary just a couple of years ago. In this 60-year time, we have grown significantly. We are a designated national resource center by the U.S. Department of Education, which also imbues us with an important responsibility to the public. So the Center for Middle East and North African Studies, through this colloquium, promotes the study and public scholarship and sharing of knowledge on the histories, cultures, languages, and peoples across this complex and significant region through research, education, and outreach programming. Our colloquium happens every fall semester where we invite experts across the world from multiple disciplines to speak on a topic to center the discussion across 7 to 8 sessions per semester. Today, I believe, is our 5th of 7 sessions. Our theme for the colloquium this fall is Higher Education and Reformation Across the Middle East and North Africa, a Geopolitical Exploration. Today's theme, with our 2 invited guest experts, focuses on the importance of epistemic networks and international institutions in how higher education institutions have come to be and have come to have an impact in the Middle East and North Africa. We are grateful to 2 co-sponsors for today's session, the African Studies Center at the International Institute, where we are also housed, and the Department of Anthropology at the College of LS&A at the University of Michigan. Today, we have 2 speakers, Dr. Eric Burton and Dr. Florian Kohstall. Professor Burton is at the University of Innsbruck in Austria, and his presentation today is entitled The Nile Route and Other Pipelines, Decolonization, the Cold War, and Africans' Routes to Higher Education Overseas, 1957 to 1965. Eric Burton is an assistant professor in global history at the University of Innsbruck. Previously, he held positions and fellowships at universities of Leipzig, Legon, Exeter, and Vienna. His first monograph on Tanzania's African socialism and the 2 German states was awarded the Walter Markov Prize by the European Network in Universal and Global History. In his current research project, Dr. Burton examines the evolvement of Dar es-Salaam, Accra, and Cairo as hubs of decolonization for the African liberation movements. After this presentation, we will hear immediately thereafter by Dr. Florian Kohstall at the Free University of Berlin in Germany. His presentation is entitled, Do We Need Another University Reform in the Middle East? Exploring the Unintended Consequences of International Support. Professor Florian Kohstall is the Director of the Global Responsibility Program at the Freie University of Berlin. He's also a founder of Academics in Solidarity and a project lead of the Berlin Center for Global Engagement at the Berlin University Alliance. From 2010 to 15, he was head of the Cairo office of the Free University in Berlin. His research interests comprise university reform, consequences of internationalization, and different conditions of knowledge production and new forms of solidarity. His latest publication includes Academics in Exile, Networks, Knowledge Exchange, and New Forms of Internationalization with Vera Aksenova and Carola Richter. So welcome to both of these experts today. We're very grateful for their time. And as a introduction to the public that is joining us, our approximately 2 hours together today will entail 3 broad phases or parts. First, we will begin with 20 to 30 minutes of prepared remarks by each presenter. Then we will pivot to step 2, which is a question and answer period with the public. So if you're joining us by Zoom, I encourage you to use the question and answer tool in the Zoom toolbar. We will not be able to see you, unfortunately, but I will be more than glad to bring in your questions and introduce them as moderator to our experts today. After that, we will take a 5-minute break and reconvene for our third and final portion of our meeting, which is a closed-door conversation with a group of undergraduate and graduate students from across the university enrolled in this colloquium for a conversation about the scholarship in more depth. As you said, we will now move to Florian Kohstall's presentation. Dr. Kohstall, the floor is yours. You are muted at the moment, just FYI. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just trying to get the presentation now ready as well. Something went a little bit wrong. Sorry, I don't know why. Oh. Okay.
And same as with Eric, I'll do a 20-minute time check signaling that there's 10 minutes remaining at that point.
Okay, yeah.
All right, perfect, thank you.
Now you could see, now you should be able to see the presentation, right?
We can, in fact, if you press full screen, we'll see it even better, I think, if it works for you.
Right, okay, here we are.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. First of all, Mozammel and Christine for inviting me, and also the Center for the Middle East and North Africa Studies, University of Michigan. I'm very glad, and also have to congratulate to putting together such a strong colloquium with 7 sessions on higher education. I think despite the importance of universities and higher education in the Middle East, it is still rather a neglected subject, and it's very important to treat. And yeah, I also like that we have like these 2 presentations today, one more historic about student and politician roots, sort of, and how they are creating their networks. And mine is now a sort of brutal way to the present, let's say, even if most of my research has been done in the 90s and in the 2000s. So shortly before the uprisings. It's, yeah, a shift to the present and a shift to the politics of education and especially university reform. And I have in my title mentioned this rather or chosen this rather provocative title: do we need another university reform in the Middle East? Most international experts would say yes, but I don't think that it is that obvious. And this is because since decades, international organizations have been present in reforming the university system in the Middle East, and the results, as you might know, have been rather mediocre. Now, a few introductory remarks about my research and how you as that have read the article might place this article within my research. As I have said in the beginning, my research on higher education reform was conducted mainly in the 1990s and in the beginning of the 2000s. I have focused on the policy process and the role of donors, mainly in 2 countries, Egypt and Morocco, 2 distinct countries in terms of the features of limited pluralism, Morocco being a monarchy, dominated by the king, but also with a relatively wide pluralism of political parties. And Egypt being a republic with a strong presidential system, and under Mubarak, especially a sort of quasi one-party system with a very limited role of oppositional forces. I was mainly interested while doing my research on the so-called politics of commissions. This was to show that even in authoritarian country, there is some kind of pluralism when it comes to policy making, but this kind of analyzing these politics of commissions allowed me to analyze who are the in and the outsiders of reform politics and how donors contribute to the reproduction of specific, in this case, authoritarian regimes. The uprising of 2011 gave me the opportunity of exploring the link between the provision of social goods and regime continuity. That means how students engaged, for example, in the process, in the protests, not only during the uprising, but also before the uprising, and how the regime was dealing with resistance somehow. And I think 2011, the uprisings of 2011, but also before, shows clearly that universities in the Middle East are arenas of contentious politics, as we can see this now also very lively, sort of lively, yeah, probably not the most adequate term for that, in Iran. And they are somehow often called an ersatz arena, so an arena of substitution for politics of the official political arena. Today in my presentation, I would like to push the analysis even a little bit further, and I would like to focus on what I call the unintended consequences of international support. So not only why this international support to reforms of higher education in the Middle East has barely been successful in terms of improving the university, but also why it has somehow reinforced or stabilized authoritarian regimes. To that extent, or before I explain this a little bit more in detail, I'm going here to focus, first of all, what we commonly call the crisis of higher education in the Middle East and how it is portrayed. I think it is very important to see that university systems in the Middle East, and especially in the huge countries like Egypt, but also in Morocco, have undergone very crucial changes in the past decades. While shortly after independence, especially in the 50s and 60s, but also in the 70s, the focus was on the expansion and democratization of higher education. In the 90s, we have turned to a new credo, which was the quality of education. So the thing is, in fact, that this democratization of higher education has also led to overcrowding and massification, which is most visible in huge universities, like, for example, those being present in Cairo, like Cairo or Ain Shams, who have more than 250,000 students today. Another shift that occurred was that while there was for example, in Egypt, an employment guarantee for university graduates, the state, with increasing privatization, had to abandon this job guarantee for graduates. And this, among other factors, contributed to the emergence of a new movement, one that became particular visibility, for example, in Morocco, the so-called graduates without jobs. An additional factor for the crisis of education is that the promise of education, of free education that was given especially by socialist regimes or socialist-inspired regimes like Gamal Abdel Nasser, was gradually undermined through private tutoring and the establishment of private universities starting in the 1990s. In general, the investment of Arab countries in higher education is comparatively low when we compare it to their investment, for example, in primary and secondary education, but also worldwide. And what has to be noticed that most of the investment goes into the salaries, while at the same time, these salaries for professors are in many countries that low that professors cannot even make a living out of the state salary, and the salary doesn't create their independence. I mean, as you know, for example, in the United States, a decent salary and the possibility of tenure is one of the major characteristics of academic freedom, which in turn is another crucial characteristic of the universities. A fifth factor is that especially the humanities and social science, they are suffering from state interference, and that the sciences are not adequately preparing for the labor market. I could now go on with this list. I could give a whole talk only about the so-called deficiencies or the crisis of higher education, but this is not where I would like to stay. I would rather now focus what international organizations make out of this crisis and how this translates into concrete reform measures. Now, when we nowadays try to map the different forms of international intervention, it becomes already relatively complicated. Of course, we have the, let's say, even traditional actors, like, for example, the World Bank, that from the 1990s started to push for the reform of tertiary education. It didn't do so before. There was also clearly a shift that we could observe before the 1990s. That the World Bank was mainly interested in pushing for reforms of primary and secondary education, and only in the 1990s became really interested when it published, for example, these reports entitled Building Knowledge Society, in this cradle that tertiary education is also a crucial part of the development policies of developing countries. Now, what I mean here by the second point, deploring the crisis, celebrating the achievements, when you read these reports of, for example, the World Bank, that is one of the major donors to reform tertiary education, then you can actually observe that on the one hand, the general reports, like, for example, higher education in the Middle East, the road not traveled, they always deplore the crisis, while reports that are done after a reform circle are celebrating the achievements. Now, what donors are doing, especially the World Bank, is prescribing best practices and providing models for reform. This will become visible in a minute when I'm talking about the concrete experiences of Morocco and Egypt with donors like the World Bank, but also the French cooperation. But in general, this international intervention is much more complex than that if we look at the higher education sector and universities. It is today not only made up of the direct participation of the World Bank or other donors in the reform process, but it is also made up of a lot of, let's say, inspiration for policymakers. If this is through rankings that universities should be more competitive and that we have to adjust certain indicators at the university or certain even employment policies at the universities according to ranking indicators, etc. All in all, and this complicates again the fact it is international has become the central buzzword and a driver of reform. Internationalization here not only understood as the mobility of students and staff, but also as the transfer of and circulation of international reform recipes. Now, what I'm trying to do now, what I was trying to do in my research was to compare how this international intervention manifests in countries with different regimes, especially in terms of pluralism, but also in terms of their higher education system. And to what extent this becomes sort of manifest then in the politics of the reform process. That means how different actors are interacting within this reform process, but also in terms of policies. Now, looking at Egypt, the World Bank impact on the reform was relatively direct. The World Bank, in fact, prepared a new loan and called for this purpose on the minister to set up a committee that should prepare certain reform recommendations. The main objective of the bank, but also of the government, was to close the so-called quantity-quality gap. Meaning that what I was referring before, we had a large increase in terms of participation in higher education in the number of students, but this rapid expansion was also sort of made responsible for the decreasing quality of education. So the main objective was of the World Bank was now to close this quality, the quantity-quality gap, and move in general the reform efforts of the Egyptian government more towards a focus on quality. That means, for example, curriculum reform, but also accreditation, etc. What they used in the Egyptian case, they discussed the system as a whole, but what they used finally was a so-called grant-based approach to enable departments and faculty members to present their own project in order to start and implement that reform. What was interesting enough was that the huge and controversial subjects of higher education reform were quickly excluded from the discussion. This concerned the system of admission. That was, of course, one of the major factors that fostered this continuous growth of higher education. And another controversial subject was were the salaries of professors, where it was said, if we start with this subject, then we cannot pay this reform, and this is why we have to sort of exclude it. It is interesting also when we discuss this reform in terms of politics. I said already that the World Bank advocated for this participatory approach. And here was sort of, also my gravity of analysis. who was included and who was excluded. And in the case of Egypt, barely any opposition politician from the smaller oppositional parties was included in the work of these committees, but sort of the reform was rather drafted by different representatives out of the university. So one might call them sector elites that relatively well also portray the degree of limited pluralism that existed at the time in Egypt beneath the dominance of the ruling party. So what was important for the government was sort of to bring university leaders into this reform process, but also this rather proved to be relatively limited, because when we looked afterwards, especially at the implementation of the reform, we saw that it was rather limited amount of professors from the Faculty of Engineering that had engaged already before in another reform that were implicated in this process. Beside from this reform, and this is where the real change happened, so most of the universities in Egypt are still public universities, and this was also the group of universities that the reform itself targeted. But before the reform already, the government had drafted a new law for the establishment of private universities. And what one could observe is, while we had this relatively limited reform of the public universities, the growth that took really place, or the change that took really place, concerned private and foreign universities that were established in Egypt. Now, if we compare this reform now quickly with what happened in Morocco.
Florian, pardon my interruption. This is just a time check that we have 10 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now, if we look at Morocco, we can see that the World Bank also had a strong impact in putting the reform on the agenda of the government. The World Bank report that was prepared at the time, it was even used by the king to discredit the government that was at the time in the hand of the Socialist Party. And then the World Bank became a little bit more invisible in this process. But what the king actually did was to set up a royal commission with representatives of all different parties, including also representatives of syndicates, of student representatives, to build a consensus on the controversial issues of university reform. At the time in Morocco, that was mainly the language policy and the question of the provision of public and private education. So in comparison with Egypt, the arena for reform in the case of Morocco was much more pluralized, which is inherent, or what I tried to show is inherent to the Moroccan political system, where there is quite a lot of pluralism beneath, of course, the authority of the king. Now, one could expect now that this led also to better reform results in terms of policy, but this is not necessarily what happened, because there were important changes taking place after the work of the commission. The reports were rediscussed, and finally, through a new selection system of university presidents, the reform was delegated to the university presidents directly from the king. They are under the direct authority of the king. And another aspect that was happened, instead of solving the question of language policy and the public and private provision of education, a European model was sort of used. The introduction of the LMD system, which is a sort of French adoption of the Bologna system, was used as a magic stick to push this reform forward. Now, having briefly discussed these contrasts and similarities between Morocco and Egypt, I think one can conclude on the following. Concerning the reform cycle, I think what is visible not only in Egypt, but also in Morocco is that in the public perception, due to this relatively limited results on the micro level, that means in the university itself, the public perception is that reform is rather absent. At the same time, when one looks sort of at this macro level of reform, that means the involvement of different donor organizations and politicians and policymakers, one can rather observe that the university remains subject to a continuous cycle of reforms. And one might ask if this is rather healthy or not for the development of the university. When it comes to donor policies itself, one can observe that large efforts are spent to build a consensus and integrate stakeholders in the decision-making process. But when we further look into the implementation process of the reforms, we can observe that the final decisions and the implementation itself is rather done by relatively small circles of, transnationally, and here we come to the term also of epistemic communities that should bring us together, but to policymakers that share a lot of experience in international conferences, etc., and then implement this experience in the domestic context, but accordingly to the rules that exist in this domestic context. And this is also why the potential of change is relatively limited. Another observation that I made, especially with regard to the involvement of international donor organizations and how the debate around the reform of higher education takes place, that a thorough country analysis is often missing, and that the discussion revolves mainly around these buzzwords of internalization, Europeanization, the adaptation to the international context, and World Bank terms such as world-class universities, but they barely focus on the domestic context. In order to conclude, where are the unintended consequences of international support? On the one hand, in a reproduction of a specific type of limited pluralism that is constitutive for the regime. So there is we cannot expect a regime change due to the way these reforms are prepared. Unintended is probably also that in most cases we observe a bypassing of the existing university system instead of an overhaul. This is especially visible in Egypt with the growth of private universities that are considered now as the motor of higher education, while they only integrate a relatively small part of the population. And another unintended consequence is certainly, and this is observable throughout the Middle East, I think, is that this international support is less considered as a support, then finally as a foreign intervention due to this relatively limited access to other constituencies. Last but not least, and this is finally my concluding sentence and might be also open a point for discussion, as long as the autonomy is that restricted as it is in case of universities, if it is in Morocco or if it is in Egypt, this will always inhibit further reforms. So basically, do we need another university reform in the Middle East? Yes and no. Yes, I think because the institution, the university itself should be granted more autonomy in order to give it the capacity to reform itself. And as long as we do not have this important degree of autonomy, most of the so-called national reforms inspired by international organizations might fail. And this was, yeah, this is how I'm going to finish for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florian. I very much appreciated the different level and approach that your talk contrasted with our previous talk. If I may briefly summarize and open the next session to the Q&A, two or three brief reminders. Number one, if you're joining from the public and certainly from the classroom, please use the Q&A tool in Zoom to submit your questions and or comments, but ideally questions that I can pose to our panel of experts, as it were. And we can have a discussion. Let me see the time here. We have time for 10 to 15 minutes of a public Q&A session. The second reminder would be that Florian and Eric, we're of course very lucky to have you present your expertise, but in this session, we also welcome and encourage crosstalk between the panel members because you come from different backgrounds, and so there may be interesting insights and reflections and reactions that you may have of each other as well. And as a third point of kind of summarizing and beginning this session of public Q&A and discussion, if I may, I will summarize at a very, very aggregate level and say that, Eric, I particularly enjoyed and appreciated the process tracing that you performed of unique experiences of individuals in a particular political and post-colonial context as they navigated various higher education environments and institutional constraints. And in contrast, and I think in complementary contrast, Florian, I particularly appreciated the institutional anatomy that you performed of the higher education space more centrally. And between both of your talks, I have inspiration and curiosity and questions surrounding some reflection on how has higher education as an institution and a context grown in the context of the Middle East? Why in this particular time period, let's call it modernization, and then now today, late modernity, what are the evolutions in why this space and this institutional environment has captured more gravity and importance? How has it scaled in terms of which actors that it supports? I would imagine there may be some parallels with what's happening in our advanced industrialized economies, where higher education was perhaps for the more elite grooming and finishing schools and has rapidly scaled in the mid 1900s to be a mass knowledge capability producing space. And that may be shifting in different ways as questions and uncertainties begin and rise about the return on investment that states and other investors put importance in this space. So I have many, many interesting questions, but I think in this session, we will give priority to the public and the students to pose their questions. So if you're listening and if you're curious and interested, again, please use the Q&A tool and we'll begin. I don't have any questions right now. I'll draw them in as they come in. But to get the conversation going, I'll pose a welcome to both or either Florian or Eric, as you listen to each other's talks, did you have a question or two that you wanted to pose for discussion? And if you do for the other speaker, please volunteer and begin. Otherwise, I can also offer some questions directed to either of you. I know it's a non-traditional way to ask the panel if they have a question for each other, but we can experiment in this colloquium. Florian, I think you had in your hand.
Yeah, I was, I mean, among the many points that your presentation, Eric, was raising, I was particularly interested also what you said about the non-welcoming or practices in Cairo of students from the African continent. And I mean, we often forget when we talk about internationalization, especially in a Eurocentric way, that Cairo hosts today a lot of international students, not only from Africa, but also from Malaysia and Asia. So it is still somehow a center for international student flow. So I was really interested if you could go a little bit, because you mentioned it a little bit on the side, if you could a little bit go into the details, what at the moment was so disturbing for African students and about, yeah, how many flows we are talking about. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, that's also a question that I myself am still having, because the source base for that is still quite thin, that I'm working on there. And it's also one of the points that I wanted to introduce to the talk that I haven't mentioned up on in the paper yet. So I'm glad you're asking there. And what I can say for this particular point is that the students voiced their concerns about particularly different treatments of foreign students in regard to the stipends that they were getting. So they were pointing out that students from Lebanon were getting like 10 times the rates that they were getting for their monthly allowance, for instance. And also students that came from Russia also still got a higher rate. So they pointed out that there were some different treatments there. Then they also lamented the fact that they had to learn Arabic and that there weren't yet established courses in English, or then for others from French West Africa, also in French. And one thing that comes up not only in this piece of evidence, but also in so many other memoirs of people who are not generally just students, but also members of liberation movements, politicians, so to say, activists. Very many of them comment upon the fact that they now come as Black Africans to Cairo, and they're not being seen as, well, part of a common African continent there in Egypt, but that they encounter themselves as being looked down upon as Africans, and Egyptians see themselves as Arabs. And this is something that's very often mentioned in these memoirs. And at the same time, there are also sources from a number of actors in Egypt that are, of course, trying to have these new Pan-African institutions and try to produce Pan-African sentiment, a Pan-African identity in Cairo at the time. And as I'm sure you know, under Nasser, there was this idea of the three circles, Egypt being part of the Islamic circle, the Arab circle, and then also the African circle. Mm-hmm. And so this whole expansion also of the university, then new courses, new institutions being established there, is also testimony, I think, to some really earnest efforts of Nasser and the other actors in this area to add substance to these efforts, right? But at the same time, there were, of course, these were still early institutions, and so many things didn't work out, and there were on the ground a number of inequalities in treatment that were then pointed out. But as I said, there's still much more work to be done there, also with Egyptian sources, of course, that need to be tackled, and which, as we all know, is not that easy at the moment to get to these sources.
As a quick follow-up to that, Eric, thank you so much. I have a question here from one of our students related to this theme of being colorized and otherized. And perhaps I'll pose it in two parts, and you can engage with either or both as you like. Kind of a broad question is, As you're a historian, you described your approach and field as global history, and I think that means something particular. Perhaps you can explore that a little bit. I think one of the commonalities between both your and Florian's work today that you're demonstrating is that you couch your study of phenomenon in an international system with global flows and institutional interactions in a world system. So the first part of the question is this experience of being otherized in the way that you're observing and unpacking. How does it mesh with historical experiences, perhaps going back further in time in these environments, in other civilizational contexts? Is the type of otherizing, the racial otherizing, more encased in the post-colonial context? Because I would imagine, being, I would imagine various forms of xenophobia are a human condition that travel across time. So I'm curious in which ways it's, what is unique in this particular context. And that takes me to the more specific question from the student. Nina Navziger asks, for either panelist, I was drawing a link between the, quote, color bar, unquote, developed by colonial leaders in East Africa, with a concern about focus on colonial Western thinkers and bureaucrats staying after the colonial period, and the concern about international intervention in higher education reform, where potentially ideas of Western education and bureaucracy could be the new model. I was curious if either panelist had any thoughts on this connection. I know that was a complex question, so I may repeat if you like. In the way that I understand it most parsimoniously. So this question is, Nina Navziger is drawing a link between the color bar, in quotes, developed by colonial leaders in East Africa. And I think the question is, you can engage more broadly. Have you encountered this, and how does it interact with the higher education reform space with regard to the Western education promoting a bureaucracy as a new model? So I'll leave it there. I know that I've kind of expanded it quite a bit, and so you can pick whatever is most connecting with your interest and work.
I think Florian, you go first, perhaps, because I've been already talking for some time.
Yeah, right. I think my part of the question concerns rather if I understand it right, the reform recipes and the models that are promoted to reform higher education. And as I said before, that this space has become relatively complex, because on the one hand, we have the models prescribed by important donor organizations like the World Bank. So that means grant-based, giving out money to departments, etc., to start and promote the reform, promoting accreditation, or promoting this model of world-class universities. Then there are other Western models coming in. I don't know if we can only call them Western model, but of course, for example, the Bologna process of the European Union, which has become one of the most successful export models for reform, is a European model. But that doesn't mean that the process is only informed by these models. I think especially now, Chinese models are concurring with Western models very strongly. And within the African continent is, for example, interesting to see, I mean, that Morocco, it adopted a French fashion model, adopted it to the Moroccan context as a LMD, so the Bologna process as a LMD model, and then exported it to other countries like Burkina Faso and other West African countries as a Moroccan model. So what is happening is at each time these models are refashioned because of a certain resistance to these foreign models, and they are adapted in a way that they, I mean, in my regard, very widely divert from the original model. Yeah? So there is this process of acclimatization, we might call it, of very complex transfer, where at some point it doesn't make sense anymore to call it Western or a white model, but rather a completely refashioned model. Yeah.
Thank you. Eric, do you have any take on the color bar concept?
Yeah, I think it's a very complex question, especially then also thinking about this in a longer period. One thought I had on this is that actually right from the outset, when there are thoughts about now establishing universities also in East Africa, there's this question of what kind of model should this university actually be, like what kind of education should be offering. And I think there are two dimensions here. The one is that, of course, through the history of colonial rule and the exclusion from university education, there's very much this effort to join, so to say, the group of established universities and do something similar. And regarding that, what's being done in Great Britain, in the United States, to some extent, perhaps also in Moscow, that this is the standard and this is something to be adhered to, right? And because one has been excluded from this is, as itself is already seen as an achievement. At the same time, there are also then intellectuals who are questioning, of course, Western models, Western epistemes, asking, well, should we adhere to these standards at all? So it's in a way, these are two contrasting processes and there's a tension between these. And these are also connected to the question of if we adhere, for instance, to the same standards of, let's say, engineering and engineering studies, won't we also become dependent on Western, again, engineering firms and technologies, etc.? Should we have a homegrown form of engineering that's adapted to our local environments, etc.? And so that's quite interesting to follow these processes. And then one can have one can see discussions in the 60s and 70s in Tanzania, for instance, where then engineering students are in conversation with West German engineering teachers, and then the West Germans will say, well, in Tanzania, you don't have the conditions for that kind of knowledge, so to say, it's not useful for you. And the Tanzanians will say, well, but we want the most up-to-date knowledge and the most sophisticated knowledge that's available, right? And there's this continuity here of coloniality very much. And this is very much negotiated and also in day-to-day conversations, and I think these things are being discussed until today, right? Though of course now with particularly China, but also other countries being able to offer much more also here in terms of cooperation, there's really, even to a larger extent than already in the 60s, a multiplication of models and opportunities, and it's really multi-directional, but it already is to some extent in the 1960s as well.
Thank you both for engaging with that complex topic. As a time check, unfortunately we are now going to close the public Q&A session, not because we don't have more questions. We actually have some more exciting questions, but thankfully I know the individuals posing these questions, they will reappear in the next session. So I will encourage them to bring these items for discussion. But I believe we are all due, especially our guests, for a well-deserved 5-minute break. So feel free to take a break. We'll use the time here to reset the Zoom session for our roundtable discussion format. For those of you who joined us from the public today, thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. And please do tune in and stay tuned for future thematic. We have 2 more sessions remaining in our colloquium this fall. And thank you, Florian and Eric, for your prepared remarks and your Q&A contributions thus far. We will see you in 5 minutes. Thank you.